It's Taj of the Beat.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a middle and high school principal and a high school social studies teacher. And as always, I'm joined by
Manuel Rustin, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher, and this, of course, is All the Above, the show that brings you news and analysis of all things related to education. Jeff, man, it's great to be back, isn't it?
It is.
Season 3.
We had a little hiatus there, a little summer vacation.
We did have a little extended summer vacay, but we're back and we're excited about this new season, and we hope you are too. Of course, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button or that follow button so that you don't miss any of the great things that we have in store for this season. Now, as for today's episode, Jeff, what is on the agenda?
Well, Manuel, we got a good one for everybody, of course. We start off with our headlines, with our do now as usual. Got some fascinating stuff in education. We might have to issue some grades to people today.
Already, man?
And 5-week, 10-week, the year is going. But our main segment for today is actually a segment we haven't done in a while, which is a show and tell. And so, folks, this guy to my left here has been good enough to bring in an item for today's show and tell, which is going to help us talk about really the language that we use in education, help us talk about terms that we throw around and that have great meaning, but sometimes bring with them controversy, like at risk. Right. So we're going to get into that today. We're going to unpack the language we use in education and the impact it has on how we think about the work.
Indeed. All right. So thank you again for joining us as we embark on this brand new season. And next, we'll take a look at some recent headlines that you might have missed. All right, folks, now it's time for the Do Now, where we take a look at recent headlines in education. Jeff, how are we doing the Do Now today?
Well, Manuel, I think given that we are, we're into the fall, right?
We are into the fall.
The school year's going, and
That
it's
is
time.
true.
It's time for a little progress check. It's time for the
Already.
It's time for the parents to know
Already.
how we're doing.
Already. Man, always so
so
focused on the grades, man. Dang.
I mean, listen, trying to get to graduation, right?
Yeah, you're right.
So we have a report card today.
All right.
We're going to issue some grades to some people out here.
All right, let's do it. Let's see what the first grade is. Bad news, Jeff.
Bad news. Tell me about it.
School year just started. I thought we were all supposed to start with A's because it's brand new school year. But in this case, we have an F. F for fired.
Ooh.
Now, this is a story out of Florida. Some of you may have heard about the 6-year-old who was arrested by a school resource officer. So the Orlando school resource officer who arrested a 6-year-old girl has recently been fired from the police department. The grandmother of the girl said that she received a phone call informing her that her granddaughter was being taken to a juvenile hall facility, and the reason given was that the granddaughter had a temper tantrum and kicked out at an adult. And the grandmother says the granddaughter suffers from sleep apnea, and that may be the reason why she was in a bad mood that day and lashed out at the adult. Also, another reason why she may have lashed out at the adult is because she is a 6-year-old kid, and 6-year-olds, they do that. But this school resource officer by the name of Officer Dennis Turner went ahead and arrested the girl as well as another 6-year-old at the school that day as well. We don't have information about what that second arrest was about, but arresting 6-year-olds, Jeff, is that what we're doing in 2019?
Apparently.
So.
I mean, what can I say? America, right? This is how it goes. This story is just bananas. Like, I saw this, honestly, when I first saw this headline, it was on social media, flipping through my feed, and I saw it, and I just got this sinking feeling, and I just kept going. I was like, I'm going to have to read that another time, because I don't have it. I don't have it right now to read about a 6-year-old black child getting arrested at school. This is crazy. So, yes, the story is just as crazy as you think it is, right? A 6-year-old, this is, kindergarten, first grade, right? And hey, I will even stipulate, let's say the kid was wildly out of control, threatening people, whatever, right? The worst possible tantrum you can imagine. I'm not quite sure what sleep apnea has to do with that, but whatever. Let's just say the behavior was as bad as it could possibly be. We're talking about a 6-year-old in a room of adults.
Yeah.
And this room of adults thought the good idea was involve the police and arrest the child, right? And try to bring this child into the same criminal justice system with murderers and rapists and things, right?
Get them started early.
This is crazy. Completely crazy.
Yeah, we talk about the school to prison pipeline, and this is almost like a fast forward, jump through the pipeline and just get to the end. Just take the 6-year-old straight to jail.
What's more direct than a pipeline?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
like that's just.
They're like, beam me up, Scotty. No pipeline, just straight
there.
to
do not pass go.
Yeah.
So black students represent 15% of the total student enrollment during the 2015-2016 school year, but according to Education Department's Office for Civil Rights, they make up 31% of students referred to law enforcement. And in this case, a 6-year-old being referred to law enforcement. Now, Jeff, when I first heard the story, for one, I wasn't surprised I was out of Florida, because Florida. But I was surprised when I saw the officer's photo. I'm going to be honest here. I assumed it was a white officer who arrested this black girl and took her in. In the first photo that I saw that came out showed a black officer and a white officer together, one being awarded something, and I assumed it was that white officer. But it was the black officer who arrested this girl, which is another reminder that when we talk about systemic racism, when we talk about something like the school to prison pipeline, it acts on a systemic level, not an individual level. And in this case, this individual officer, who has a host of questionable things in his past, not even questionable, just downright foul activity in his past and behaviors in his past, went ahead and fully participated in this school to prison pipeline as the black adult in the room. And this is just shameful.
Yeah, 100% shameful. And I believe that for the hip hop heads out there, Ice Cube has some interesting commentary on this issue of the behavior of black police officers. So we'll let that be for now.
As does KRS-One.
As does KRS-One. So that's an issue long since discussed and settled.
Yeah.
But I will say, to give a little bit of context here, because as much as I think the criticism is 100% warranted on this particular school resource officer and on this particular charter school, the policy that the officer was supposed to be bound by was getting approval from a supervisor in order to issue an arrest of a child under, I believe, the age of 12. Now, I don't think we have any business arresting any child under the age of 12, but I'm glad that kind of policy is in place, and at least there's some check. And this officer did not follow that policy. So this officer really was out of line with that. Another officer involved realized that the policy was not being followed, and also intervened to prevent the sort of booking of one of the children. So the story at least has like sort of a semi silver lining in the cloud.
The other 6-year-old was taken in and processed. This 6-year-old, the girl in this case, she was taken back by the other officer, which is great. But the other boy, at least as far as the reporting goes, was taken all the way in.
Yeah. So crazy. The system that's broken had a check, and that check failed, to further break the system.
Jeff, why do we have police officers on elementary school campuses? Not gonna lie. Of all the discussion about school resource officers in the era of school shootings, I always picture school resource officers in high schools. The idea of one being at an elementary school campus. I don't know if that's specifically because of the threat of school shooters or what, but I don't know why you need an officer dealing with little kids.
I certainly the districts that I have worked closely with at the elementary level, I'm not familiar of there being an armed officer stationed at schools. I am familiar with, officers rotating amongst different schools. And at the elementary level, particularly being of resource to the school when there's issues in the community or issues with, maybe gang violence or things that are happening around the school, or even like, two parents that are kind of going at it, and they're worried about an altercation amongst the adults. I'm not very familiar with the needs for the police to be policing the elementary school children, that's just...
Yeah.
The story is as bad as you think it is, folks.
Man, what a start to the year.
Yeah.
Well, he's been fired. I mean, to give, I guess, credit where credit is due, they did not wait long. I believe he was fired within the week of that happening. So that's actually pretty rare to hear of an officer being fired that soon after any kind of controversy or infraction. So, there's that.
There's that.
F plus.
Silver linings.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. What's the next story that we have for today's Do Now?
All right, Manuel. Next up, our next grade is a D.
Dang.
Man, I think sometimes we need to try to find higher grades
Yeah,
in our
man.
report cards. Let's model college readiness.
Let's do that.
But today, this D is a D as in disparity. D is in disparity. So here's the story. The publication, The Voice of San Diego, recently released a database of San Diego area school data showing comparative results for San Diego schools on something called the California Healthy Kids Survey. And it shows huge disparities throughout the district on all kinds of measures impacting student learning. Now, for all of our viewers outside of the state of California, the California Healthy Kids Survey is given throughout the state, and it's one measure that's used in the accountability system under state guidelines. It is administered to kids in grades 5, 7, 9, and 11, so sort of the end of elementary school through most of high school, and measures things like school safety, measures how engaged students are in their learning, relationships they have with adults, supports on campus, and then for older students, even things like substance abuse prevalence or suicidal ideation among peers. It's generally a culture and climate of the school type of survey. So in the city of San Diego, in San Diego Unified School District, we have these huge disparities. Wealthier and nicer schools with almost all the kids saying it's safe.
Right.
Poorer, more heavily minority schools, half of the kids saying it's safe, type of a thing, right? So big disparities, maybe mirroring the same type of disparities we see with test scores and graduation rates and that sort of thing. So, Manuel, what do you think here?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised by the disparities really at all. And San Diego, for those who aren't familiar, I mean, that district spans a wide area that includes really wealthy, affluent neighborhoods and really struggling neighborhoods and marginalized populations. So to see these disparities, not too big of a surprise. I mean, we've heard stories in the past about discipline disparities within San Diego schools with regards to the impact that harsh discipline has had on Black students and foster youth, and the lack of suspensions and expulsions in more affluent schools. So this is in line with that, I think, in terms of these disparities. It is a reminder, of course, that when we're talking about educating our youth and we're talking about how students are doing, how schools are doing, it's about so much more, obviously, than test scores, but asking the students how they feel about their surroundings is kind of like a basic step that I feel like a lot of times we forget about in education. And to have 99% of students at what school is that? Ocean Beach Elementary report that they have an adult who cares about them. 99%, I mean, that's 99% on any scale is like, wow. But in this case, almost every student there feels that there's an adult that cares about them, where it's less than half at another elementary school. Think about being an elementary school student who feels that no adult at the elementary school cares for you. I mean, that's the foundation right there. If you're learning in first, second, third grade that nobody cares about you, then, what does your educational outlook look like? I mean, it's not surprising. It's sad, but.
Yeah, I agree with you from that standpoint, and I both want to make sure we give the fuller context of this, so it's not to suggest that what we're doing is just throwing San Diego Unified under the bus.
Nah.
Because the reality is that we could list off probably every significantly large district in the state of California has the same type of disparities going on, right? So this just happens to be a story out of San Diego. It's a huge district, so it is obviously really significant in terms of sample size. That said, you could probably walk down, the street here and find similar disparities in data. So I want to be clear about that. But I will say what I find kind of fascinating about this, even though this data is alarming and is a big call to action, is in the landscape of things we use for school accountability in this country. Always we're talking about test scores. We're talking about graduation rates, college applications, college acceptances, who actually winds up going to college and then who winds up staying in college, AP exams, all that stuff, right? And those are important metrics. From my standpoint, I'm not challenging them, but it does raise a question about resources and use of resources in our field. And I have long joked in my career that half of what all of the fancy accountability systems tell us, you could just pay a couple of teenagers to like walk around the community with a clipboard and just ask people, is that a good school? Is that not a good school? Is that an okay school? Is it a pretty good school? And probably get data that matches what all these complex psychometrically, sound data sources tell us, right? So I think it's an interesting kind of counterbalance to the quantitative data because it's coming from kids and their perspective on their own education. And also, even though this survey is not free, it's certainly a lot cheaper than a lot of the tests that we administer. So I do wonder also about the applicability of simple surveys as like equally valid measures of school accountability. They're actually a lot cheaper and less intrusive on the classroom than testing is in some cases.
That brings a good point. Actually, I was thinking about years where I have had students of a grade level that take the Healthy Kids survey. There have been years where it's been administered or delivered to us as teachers in a very careful way, as to like make sure we set aside time in our class period and explain it to students and explain what happens with this data and all that. And other times where it's just kind of like an email item and make sure you get this done during homeroom or whatever. So part of me wonders, especially for the higher achieving schools where data means so much and their reputation means so much perhaps to them and to the folks around there, I wonder if there's extra emphasis for the students to respond in a certain way, not to like totally, skew the results, but to make sure students realize how important the survey is and think about this and think about that and walking students through versus a school where maybe there's long-term subs everywhere and there's so many other things going on that it's like, oh, okay, we got to give out the survey real quick. I do wonder, since it is a simple survey, really simple, with a sense of, students pull it up and just, check through and click on through. I wonder if that has any role to play in terms of the results. Just curious.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it, but I will say...
I need the answer. I need the answer.
The data cited in the article from Voice of San Diego only considered schools for which there was an over 50% response rate.
Okay.
Right? And lots of the schools that they actually cited had like over 80% response rates, right? Yeah. So these are pretty, very, very large sample sizes in terms of student responses. So, that is an interesting question and maybe some PhD student out there can explore for us. Yeah. But I still think it stands that this is a really interesting data source that captures actually what kids think about their school. And I would be really curious to see, stack that up against test scores, attendance, all these other things. And I'd be willing to bet the house that we're going to see very close correlation between what schools are identified as good schools by those measures and good schools by this measure.
Yeah, and that will likely also correlate with average household income in those areas as well.
You don't say.
Yeah, quite sure it's all connected, Jeff.
Yeah.
All right, one last grade, one last story for today's Do Now. Our next grade is, we're doing better, Jeff, we're doing better.
All right.
We're up to a B.
Good news. Here we go.
Yeah, we're up to a B. In this case, B for beauty rest. In California, lawmakers recently passed a bill that requires middle schools to push their start times back to 8 a.m. at the earliest, and high schools to push their start times back to 8:30 at the earliest. The bill originally banned both middle and high schools from starting before 8:30, but to give districts more flexibility in scheduling buses, it was amended to allow middle schools to start as early as 8, while keeping high school start times at 8:30. Now, the research is mixed as to whether imposing later school start times will result in students getting more sleep, according to legislative staff analysis. But a study done by the American Academy of Pediatrics said teens not getting enough sleep was, quote, an important public health issue that significantly affects the health and safety of students. Currently in California, more than 3/4 of middle schools and high schools start before 8:30 a.m., with 3.5% of schools starting before 7:30. Before 7:30, ouch.
Yeah,
And 27% of schools starting between 7:30 and 8. Majority of schools, 47.6%, start somewhere between 8 and 8:30 a.m. Jeff, what do you think about this bill to push school start times back?
So, man, well, I actually have mixed feelings about this because I appreciate the genesis of this bill. And this is an issue that, at least among educators, has been kind of a hot topic of conversation for really like my whole career, I think, in one form or another. So I'm not upset with the push around policy at the state level here. However, I think if I had to choose a side, because I honestly think there are very compelling arguments on both sides of this case, but if I had to choose a side, I think I would come down on the side of saying this law is actually a bit of a solution looking for a problem, and that we should not force all districts into a basic start time of 8 or 8:30 for high schools and middle schools. The reason I say that is because the data is showing that already many districts in the state have already made a move themselves in that direction, right? And the places that haven't, in many cases, they're actually like some pretty big logistical challenges that are causing folks to really push back against the policy, right? So what happens if kids go to school later when their parents are responsible for dropping them off at school, right? And their parents still have to get to work on time? Are we creating larger windows of kids being unsupervised? Or are we creating situations where parents are going to face economic hardship because of that? If we're pushing school transportation more into the center of the adult rush hour, what are we creating in terms of traffic in many cities, particularly here in Southern California, the mecca of traffic, right? So are we creating unintentional problems there? Not only in terms of commute times, but also in terms of pollution, right? Those buses sitting out on the street, kicking out diesel for an extra half hour each times hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buses, right? What are we doing there in terms of air quality? So there's a bunch of things like that I think are actually legitimate concerns about this that should give us pause in thinking about this as a law, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot more challenge behind pushing back start times than I think one would think off the bat. When you think about after-school programs, when you think about busing, when you think about rush hour traffic and all of that, moving a school start time, I could see that as being much more complicated, much more difficult than an average person might think. So the California PTA is in support of this bill, along with the American Academy of Pediatrics. But a lot of groups have come out opposed to this bill. The California Teachers Association, the California School Boards Association, transportation agencies, several school districts. So you being split also reflects the fact that school districts seem to be split. 4 have publicly, at least at the time of this recording, have publicly come out in favor of it, and many have come out opposed to it. Elk Grove Unified, a massive school district, has come out against this bill. So we'll see what happens. I know myself as a adult, I think about teenagers staying up all night, playing video games and looking at their phones and not getting to sleep when they're supposed to. And I don't know that pushing back the start time of school will necessarily do anything to help in that situation. But that's me being an old man, angry that these young whippersnappers aren't getting to bed at 9 o'clock like I used to.
The youth are crazy.
They are.
They're all crazy.
If they just went to sleep on time, they could wake up and be fine.
Then they could walk uphill to school both ways, like we did,
yes,
in the
exactly.
snow and
in
everything.
the snow, California snow, big time. Yeah, man.
Exactly. I do think you brought up actually a really good point, though, right? Which is, as educators, the one flaw, like I get why the pediatricians want this policy, and I totally understand as a person who went to a high school that started at 7:25 in the morning every day.
Ouch.
Like how brutal it can be in those teenage years when your body is telling you, I'm not supposed to be up right now.
Right.
On the other hand, right, as an educator, I don't know if I could count on one hand the number of times that I have seen teenagers who were tired at school because they went to bed at a responsible time the night before and were still tired at school, right? It's almost always like I was up playing video games. I was up, we were watching a movie, my cousin's in town, and we were, had like a family celebration or whatever, or I was just watching TV or whatnot, right?
Right.
So I think as much as this is an issue to address, we also should think about what the actual issue is. Part of it is early start time, and part of it is maybe more of a public health campaign around the importance of kids, even older kids who want to stay up, having a regular and kind of healthy bedtime for their developmental state.
Where the phone isn't right next to them, buzzing all night, disturbing their sleep.
And let me be clear, I'm not going Joe Biden put on the record player, okay?
No, that's what
with
these kids need.
With this statement here,
in
I'm not saying that parents don't know how to raise their kids. I am saying I think it's easy to, when you have an older child, give them that independence, right? And they might actually need a little more structure because they biologically are in need of a longer window of sleep. And we're not going to start school at noon or something, right, to let them sleep in all morning. So regular weeknight bedtimes are a good thing, and maybe this policy could be a good thing too.
Yeah. What time does your school start at? If you're working at a school, working in a district right now, or if you're taking your kids to school in the morning, please drop a comment below, especially if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, and let us know what time does your school start at, and what are your thoughts on whether or not that start time should be pushed back. All right, so Jeff, I think that does it for this episode's Do Now.
Yes, indeed.
So we had an F, a D, and a B.
Yeah, at least we're moving in the right direction.
Moving in the right direction. We're getting there. All right, so up next will be today's show and tell. Stay tuned. For today's show and tell, I brought a copy of California's Assembly Bill 413, known by some as the At Promise Bill. This bill, which passed the legislature and, at least at the time of this recording, is sitting on the governor's desk awaiting his signature, aims to alter some of the language we use in education. AB 413 reads, quote, "At promise has the same meaning as at risk as that term is generally understood." It then goes on to replace each use of the term at risk in existing ed code with at promise. This transition from at risk to at promise is just the latest in a host of changes being made to common terms of discourse within education. For example, what was once almost unanimously billed as the achievement gap is now increasingly referred to as the opportunity gap or equity gap. Yesterday's inner city school is today's urban or Title I school. Recently, California's Ethnic Studies model curriculum received a host of criticisms and was called by the LA Times, quote, "an impenetrable melange of academic jargon and politically correct pronouncements" for its inclusion of terms like Latinx, herstory with the X, and women with the X. Some of the changes in our lexicon represent an effort to reduce the deficit-oriented narratives surrounding marginalized groups. Don't focus on that kid being at risk, instead focus on their promise and potential. Other changes represent an effort to be more inclusive. Hispanic doesn't account for people from non-Spanish speaking countries in Latin America, and Latino doesn't account for women and gender non-conforming folks, hence Latinx. Some argue that efforts like AB 413 are mere political correctness gone mad, and that this is a sign of liberal snowflakes trying not to hurt anyone's feelings. Others say that a shift towards more inclusive and asset-minded language that decenters the white cis-hetero patriarchy is long overdue. We're just getting into the groove of a new school year, so what considerations do we need to make as we fling that educational jargon across our classrooms and across our schools? So Jeff, we're just getting into the groove of the new school year. What considerations do we need to make when it comes to flinging that educational jargon across our schools and classrooms?
Wow, well, I feel like your words there were very compelling, and I am of two mindsets about this, because there are certain aspects of the jargon that I appreciate and that I think are really important for helping us challenge the kind of systems of oppression that play themselves out in schools, just like they play themselves out on the streets and in police departments and corporate boardrooms and everywhere in our society. And so I don't think there's just a one hard and fast rule that we should decide by. I don't think our folks on the far right wing who just say that this is, snowflake language and, just a hyper culture of political correctness. I totally disagree. I also think there's a point at which perhaps we go too far. And so one aspect of what you brought up was the California legislation considering the use of the term at risk,
right.
At promise in place of the term at risk. And to me, I think that is well-intentioned. I think, though, that it actually doesn't achieve the outcome we hope it to achieve. Like, nobody's going to start talking about at-promise youth, and that's going to, like, remove the deficit mindset people have about those youth. And I think it's actually hiding the reality that we have, which is there's a bunch of kids who we know in our system are, like, on the edge of not succeeding. Right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are societal. Some of them are about individuals in classrooms and principals' offices who need to do a better job. Right? And I don't see at promise as a term that actually helps that equation. I actually personally see the term at risk as being more compelling to educators who are looking to do something about that on a personal level. So, you know, to me, I see it both ways. Curious to hear more of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, the at risk, at promise actually was a little surprising to me because usually when we have conversations about deficit-oriented thinking and thinking about our language and how much words matter, a lot of times that comes around to achievement gap in inner city schools or urban schools or Title I schools and what have you. I actually haven't heard discussion myself lately about at risk, but I do remember long ago, years ago, at risk starting to seem a little bit less and less commonplace and less acceptable in educational conversations. So changing it to at promise, I have yet to hear someone use at promise in a sincere way in a standard discussion, educational conversation about marginalized youth or underperforming youth or whatever you want to say. So it kind of surprised me because it just doesn't seem like a natural phrase to use at promise. You know,
I'll put it this way: if they're at promise, then why are we worried about them? Because everything seems to be so good, doesn't it? I'm the problem is, and I totally get the intention of that switch of language is being about, let's make very clear that we are not saying that the problem rests within the child, right? The problem rests within the system that's created these conditions around the child. And of course, I agree with that 100%. But I also think that's a place where I'm like, we've created a term that is like a solution looking for a problem that's not actually helpful to addressing the problem.
How about some of the more common ones like achievement gap versus opportunity gap or equity? Because that's a very common change that I've heard. I mean, to use the phrase achievement gap, and you know, in my dissertation, I had a whole section about the achievement gap, and looking back on it, I don't feel proud about having used that terminology. Now I've thought about the terminology and the impact it has in terms of people's thinking about students and to what extent the test scores are the students' fault or the students. So what are your thoughts about the achievement gap conversation?
Yeah, so I have very strong feelings about this one, and I am very, very strongly opposed to the use of the term opportunity gap to replace the term achievement gap, and I'll tell you why. I do believe that there is such a thing as the opportunity gap, and there is such a thing as the achievement gap, and they are two different things. They're interrelated with one another. You could make a very strong argument that the opportunity gap is a large portion of, if not, nearly all of what creates the achievement gap.
All right.
But here's why I think it's really important we don't lose the term achievement gap. In America, we have this long history of wanting to frame the way things work in our society as being about opportunity. We have equal opportunity commissions, and we have, the land of opportunity and equal opportunity for all. And that all sounds well and good. But what we have created with that use of language is this context in which outcomes don't actually matter. The only thing that matters is the pretense of equal opportunity. And we all know that opportunities are not equal in our society. And that mythology leads into this space of the sort of pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps mentality, because, the system works. It's just you who has failed. You need to do something because, the system works, right? And I think that moving to just the opportunity gap actually reinforces that type of thinking to me, right? Like the policy outcomes of an opportunity gap conversation as opposed to an achievement gap conversation don't focus on the actual results. And what we need to see is, of course, a deep investment in opportunities for students in low income and Black and brown communities across this country, right? And we need to make sure that the outcomes that matter, graduation, college attendance, lifespan, income, family wealth, etc., that the outcomes actually change. And in education and K-12 education, the outcomes that we're talking about are by significant measure achievement outcomes, right? Their reading levels, their graduation rates, right? They're those sorts of things. So I believe in the opportunity gap. We should talk about opportunity gaps. We should address opportunity gaps. And even if we did, particularly in the short run, we are very likely to still see achievement gaps, and we need to work to address achievement gaps as well.
Yeah, see, I don't know. I guess I don't see the opportunity gap and achievement gap as being two separate things. I see opportunity gap for all the reasons you mentioned in terms of the differences in all the equity, lack of equity that we see in low income areas, particularly Black and brown communities, with regards to what those students receive resource wise, support wise, versus students in communities that have a lot more. That is the main driver of what has been called the achievement gap, right? So if we're talking achievement gap, a lot of times when I hear achievement gap, I think test scores, all right? And it goes right back to, Black and brown kids are scoring low, white and certain subgroups of Asian American kids are scoring high. And that gap in achievement, by calling it a gap in achievement, then just the natural inclination is to think these kids are achieving well and these kids aren't achieving well, which I think does what you mentioned in the first place in terms of putting that outcome on the shoulders of the person doing it. Like these kids are achieving low versus actually these kids haven't received nearly as much as what they need in order to do well on this test. To me, achievement gap is the terminology that supports that age-old American meritocracy ideal, because these kids, they're not achieving and what's on them for not achieving, versus opportunity being the focus of these students haven't nearly been given the opportunity because this student got arrested when they were 6 years old for having a tantrum. This student here, they're in a classroom where it's a rotating long-term sub throughout the school year, and that opportunity wasn't there for the student to achieve well on the test scores. So then when the test scores come out and there's this gap, by simply calling it achievement gap or focusing on the achievement aspect of it, it seems to just assume that the students each took this fair test and this student achieved well, this student achieved poorly, and just the inference is that it's on the students. And I think that's why it has changed. So I see the lack of opportunity as being the driver of the gap. So if the opportunities were such that students everywhere received what they needed to be their best selves and everything, then you wouldn't have the gap in achievement. Right.
So I don't disagree. I don't disagree with your logic that from a cause-effect standpoint, the opportunity gaps that exist in our K-12 education system are causal factors of the achievement gap. Like I 100% agree with that. Right. I think we're just actually talking about two different things. When we're talking about an opportunity gap, we're talking about long-term subs, school budgets, over-criminalization of kids walking to and from school, community violence. We're talking about, experience of the teachers in the classroom, right? Facilities and quality of facilities, air quality, all the stuff that leads to kids doing well and not doing well in school, right? Are part of the conversation about opportunity gaps. And we have to, I think, hold on to a conversation that actually says, at the end of the day, when we look at the things that we're trying to say, have we been successful or not with what we're doing in school, right? And I don't mean that everything that would qualify us as successful is measurable in one way or another. Like a kid loving the arts or whatever, it might be hard to measure that, right? But I would consider that a success. But the basic things as a society we think of, if you're a good school, these things are happening, right? Kids are coming to school. Kids like being at school. They're passing their classes and getting good grades.
Right.
They're applying to colleges. They're graduating. They're not being suspended, right? Those kinds of things. That the outcomes actually matter. And if we move to a conversation where we're just talking about opportunity in this system, I worry that what we're actually doing is going back to a point in time in which we did not care about the fact that graduation rates for Black and brown boys in our society were, 50%, and for the rest of the country were, 80%.
Right.
So that's what I worry about. I worry about a conversation that moves us away from, well-intentioned as it may be, that moves us away from paying attention to the results
Right.
and what actually happens as a result of the work that we're doing versus just naming the factors that we need to improve. I think we need both, but I think they are actually two different terms, and we need to use them both to name the two things we're trying to move, which is fix the inequalities and to make sure that the outcomes are equal, right?
Yeah, I fully trust in your ability to make that distinction and to understand the roots of that distinction. But I don't trust in the ability for the average educator, policymaker, parent, real estate agent to make that same distinction. So in their hands, in their far less capable hands of understanding the nuances of this conversation, I see achievement gap as being more in line with having that deficit thinking about Black and brown kids. So for them, I don't think they are capable of necessarily the brain power that you have just laid out there for everybody in the differences between these two. I think it still goes back to test scores, and these Black and brown kids aren't achieving. Damn, what's going on? Same old same.
So it's really funny. I kind of started laughing there when you said real estate agents, because that's so true, right?
Yeah.
How much of our school inequality is driven by housing inequality.
Right.
And I was a principal in the Bronx. And for those who maybe don't know New York, the Bronx is kind of the borough of the city that, let's just say, like, white gentrification was most afraid of the Bronx and came to the Bronx last. But my school was in the very southern tip of the Bronx, a neighborhood called Mott Haven. And Mott Haven has one of the highest concentrations of housing projects in the city of New York, and also had all these loft artists type spaces that were getting gentrified, and the real estate folks started calling it Sobro, which we used to laugh about until it became actually kind of a serious problem in terms of gentrification issues. And so that was just side story that made me laugh. They come in and change the name of the neighborhood, and I know for a fact that none of the people who moved into those artist lofts were sending their kids to local public schools.
Of course not.
And I don't think they were going to, whether we talked about the opportunity gap that existed for those schools or whether we talked about the achievement gap that existed for those schools. I think that hits at a much deeper cultural level than these terms do. So my thing is, I think these terms really are primarily terms that are about policy and accountability for states and districts, and also for academia and for research and for professionals in the field. Most people aren't going to sit around and be like, well, this neighborhood has a big opportunity gap, so I'm going to still send my kids to public school in this neighborhood, right? I think I hear your point, but I think we would be best served as a society by not losing the emphasis on outcomes that we have had, even though we know right now the outcomes are unequal. The outcomes reveal the fact that we have a classist and racist system that reproduces outcomes in a very predictable way along those lines, right? And a lot of that has to do with opportunity. But even if we were to say, if they were to say, all right, we're going to, spend $100 million on the schools in your district, right, from the state, and now we've closed the opportunity gap, right? We would still need to look at, well, how are the kids doing, and what are the outcomes along lines of race and class? Because no matter how much resources we have, and I'm not saying we don't need a lot more resources, I'm just saying we also need to pay attention to the results.
Okay. So what about all the other changes mentioned? Because as educators who have been in the field for a very long time, a lot of the language that we use to describe certain groups or to talk about certain systems has changed and evolved. And the ethnic studies model curriculum, which I referenced during the show and tell, is a resource that you could look at and see a lot of the changes, especially we're both history teachers, social studies teachers, and the LA Times spoke out against their curriculum as being too politically sensitive and jarbled and all that stuff because of Latinx and history and these other things. So achievement gap and opportunity gap aside, when it comes to language that is in the effort to be more inclusive, and some folks are saying it's really about sensitivity and being too left-wing. What are your thoughts on that?
So in general, I think I fully support moves to make language be inclusive and language be, for language to function in opposition to oppression, right? So I'm good with changes that fall into those categories, generally speaking. I will say there is, though, an important thing to consider, and this is like a very fine line to walk, right? Which is, at what point does the language you're using feel foreign and like strange to the masses of people? Right. And therefore alienating the very people you want to speak to because you're not speaking to them in language that they understand. I got you. Right? Versus the sort of like, well, at what point are you just perpetuating the racism and sexism and stuff that's always happened, right? So finding that exact line is a difficult thing to do, right? And it's very subjective, and it might even vary from like town to town and city to city and region to region in a state or a country. But I even like relatively recently was wrestling with the use of the term Latinx in my professional context, literally talking with colleagues saying like, hey, if we go to an event with parents, almost all of whom in this particular schools or this particular neighborhood context were going to be Latinx parents, and we say Latinx, like, do they say Latinx? Are they going to know that we are talking about them? Are they going to know that we're talking about them from a place of respect and, and wanting to celebrate them as valuable, and not as like a term that we decided should be different, right? Which, especially at that time, I mostly only heard Latinx used in like college essays, and like really it was like a higher ed term as far as I had experienced at that point. Now I think it's become much more widespread, and like people tend to say it in like popular culture references, right? So I think the needle has moved. I don't know when exactly it moved, but I know it's moved on that term, right? Herstory, maybe not. Women with the X, I'm not even actually sure how to pronounce that. To be honest, did I pronounce it right? Okay, so
I hear you.
So yes, I don't know if I'm making sense, but like there's an interesting tipping point that might be different for different terms.
Yeah, and language is ever evolving, and I think it becomes increasingly important, especially in our increasingly connected world, to hear the voices and listen to the voices outside of our own bubble, outside of our own sphere. And I know myself as an old head, somebody who grew up in the age of achievement gap, at-risk youth, inner city schools, Hispanic, like I know that I'm constantly listening and constantly learning and constantly trying to facilitate my own growth in those areas to be more inclusive and to make sure nobody's being excluded. And obviously, when it comes to using certain terms, like actually, I used Latinx in my class recently and had a student challenge me, a female student who's Mexican American. She said, "I don't like that. I like Latino." And obviously that's her thing. But she, to her that was the more comfortable phrase, and she fully understood Latinx as being an effort to be gender neutral, and she fully understood all that. But still, to her, it was like that's not the proper term. So I hear you in this idea of concern over the changing language and the tipping point, and when we're trying to use language in an effort to be more inclusive, is a particular group or identity that we're speaking of see that language in the same way, or is this something that's coming from an ivory tower and making us look even more separated and distant from the communities that we intend to serve? All very, very real and very true. So I know myself as an old head, I'm just constantly trying to learn and to practice. I'm in a serious effort to try to be more gender neutral in my terminology. Our intro to the show changed between season 1 and season 2
It did.
to not use the gender binary context, and I'm trying hard to incorporate that in my lesson plans and in the way I speak in front of students and in front of groups. And it's an effort to keep on going. And for those who say it's just snowflake stuff, political correctness, those changes to one of the curriculums that we mentioned a few episodes back, the CEO of that company was saying it's just about political correctness. Things are wonky these days. It's not that. It's not. It's really about trying to decenter our curriculum and our conversation and our power away from this traditionally patriarchal, white-centered conversation and voice, and to be a more inclusive of others. And to some, it's just words, and it's strange and it's weird, but as you learn and as you practice and as you grow, you realize like this is actually hopefully getting us to a place where we could be a more inclusive society, especially in education spaces that have traditionally been white and cis and patriarchal.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think for me in general, I try to operate by the rule of thumb of like, I'm going to defer to the community that a term is speaking to as to whether or not it's cool. And when I get the feeling, the direct message, the vibe from them that it's cool, then I will go with what they would like, right? And I think actually it's hard to do that, right? You have to like be really in tune with a lot of different groups to make smart, wise choices about that consistently. And so doing this in a curriculum, I can imagine is no small task at all, and not without great controversy. An example that comes to mind is use of the term queer, right? Which I will not use outside of like sort of an academic context, because I grew up with that word was like that was not a cool word. Like that was definitely a slur and like not a good thing. And I got educated as a kid, like that's not acceptable, right? And so I understand that for a large segment of the community, it's like it's a reclaimed inclusive term that feels empowering. And yet I feel like I need to let them own that because it's also a word with a really troubling history, right? So this is a complicated kind of landscape to walk on.
And it's all right for it to be complicated because, I mean, we're all learning and we accept that we are living in a world where, complicated is part of the undoing of so many decades and so many centuries of oppression of various groups. And it's all right for it to be complicated because we got stuff to sort out.
Yeah.
Straight up, we have stuff to sort out. So let us know what your thoughts are particularly when it comes to achievement gap and opportunity gap, because I think we're going to have to revisit that because that there's a lot to unpack there that Jeff brought up a lot of points that I hadn't previously thought about in terms of the perhaps defense of achievement gap as a term. So let us know what you think below, and please remember, if you haven't already, to hit that subscribe button or that follow button, and stay tuned because up next we have a heartfelt class dismissed. All right, folks, we have reached the end of our first episode of season 3, and this is our class dismissed, where we give shout outs to people doing great things in education. And today's class dismissed is a heartfelt, special, close to home one. Jeff, what do we got?
Well, Manuel, this is definitely close to home. We have the beginning of season 3. Of all the above has now finished, right? We are here at the end, and it's an exciting time for us. Over 2 years ago, we began the process of creating and designing this show, and putting out our first content for the world. And we've had thousands and thousands of folks view our videos, like our videos, share them with folks, and we're deeply appreciative of that. This kind of began as a wild idea and something that would be fun to do, and I think now is really an opportunity to share interesting conversations about education with a larger audience. So we want to say thanks to you, to all of our viewers, all of our followers, all of our supporters, folks who check out the podcast version of the show. We really thank you. It really means a lot, all of your support. We really appreciate it. We also have some very special shout outs because as many of you who have been following the show may know, for the last 2 years, we had like a third leg of the tripod, so to speak, who you didn't often see on camera, but was kind of the producer, technical whiz behind the show, Mr. William Obanye. He, over this past summer, moved to Texas, right? Yeah. And so we're happy for him, but also big loss for us here on the show. So part of our hiatus was spent figuring out some of the technical issues and coming up with a new setup for season 3, which of course now we've just launched and are really excited about. So shout out to Mr. Obanye from afar. Also, we want to give props to our student crew. A lot of folks might not realize by watching the show that for the last 2 years, we've had this crew of dedicated students who come in on the weekends and at nights to help us. And they're a huge part of our success. We even tried to film an episode without them one time.
And that did not go well.
It sounded like Starscream.
It was ugly.
So, yeah. So several of those students have graduated and moved on to exciting next chapters in life, so we wish them well. We're going to have a new crew of students coming in to help us for season 3 also, which is going to be great. So thanks for being on this journey with us, folks. There is much more to come.
There sure is. And speaking of much more to come, we're going to try to up our Twitter game. So if you're on Twitter, follow our new Twitter handle at AOTA Show, which is also our website, aotashow.com, where you get all the extras and all that great stuff. So again, if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe or follow. Make sure that you don't miss any of the upcoming content as we embark on this 3rd season. And we have a lot more in store. We have a lot of excellence on the way that we're excited to share with you when the time is right. So thank you for sticking with us, and we will see you again soon.